welcome to Bell Brothers Brewing.
Engineers talking about beers.
I'm Cody.
I'm Curtis.
And today we're talking about brew water.
Water. What is it good for? Absolutely everything. Why are we talking about water today, Cody?
Because beer is mostly water. Look at it. It's a liquid.
Actually, I was just reading about that, and it turns out that the average brewer is going to use between 5 and 10 times the volume of water that they produce per 1 volume of beer.
It's a lot of water to make this little cup. And you want to know where most of that water went? Cleaning. Cleaning, scrubbing. That is most of brewing.
90% of brewing is cleaning. But that's separate from what we're actually talking about. We're talking about water, the baseline for every beer out there. Why are we talking about water?
Because water is the important baseline, and there are two really important aspects to water: purity and additives.
How do we get to purity?
Purity is achieved through filtration. And now there are 3 methods to do that. You can have charcoal filters, distilled water, and reverse osmosis water. And now the real important thing from all of those that you really got to take away from it is that it will remove chlorines and chloramines, and if those are in your beer, you will know. They're a strong off flavor. And it will remove any small particulates, it will remove mold spores, and small bacteria that are allowed in the water supply because they won't harm humans, but it will ruin the flavor of your beer. So, that's important and quick ways to get purity. What about additives?
Water additives really enhance 3 different characteristics of your beer. One being yeast health and propagation, and if you're interested in the specific science of that, head on over to our yeast video and try that out and watch that video.
It's around here somewhere.
The second one is really flavor, beer flavor. It's going to enhance either your malt characters or your hoppy characters depending on which way you start to push your chemistry. And that final one, the third version, is pH. And that's pH balance. And really that helps efficiency, brew efficiency in your mash. And that's important for that piece. Well,
everybody likes a good efficient brew.
Right? Yeah. I mean, if you're not going to get good efficiency, why waste your time, right? Like, you might as well just, put some sugar in there and go for it.
Make sugar water.
Right?
So let's take a step back, because I think one of the more interesting parts about brewing water is its history and how it has affected world brewing styles.
Well, how does it affect world brewing styles, Cody?
It has affected world brewing styles because back when people first started brewing, they couldn't affect their brew water. They didn't have additives and chemistry and all sorts of other stuff that was easily available to your local brewer. So what they had to do was brew what worked where they were. And you can see that in German styles. There are no real big hoppy IPAs, pale ale style German beers. Germans do mostly malty. The hoppiest thing they make is a Pilsner. And they do go into some darker things depending on region. And that is really dictated by the chemicals in their water, and we'll get into how that really works later. But the chemicals in their water are what really dictated what styles they could brew. If you go to England, well, the UK as a whole, is actually a weird case in the sense that they could do just about anything. So it tells you they had a lot of different water sources doing a lot of different things.
I mean, if you think about it, right? They're a little island, and they got ocean water on one side. You got internal springs and lakes and rivers and whatnot. You've got canal on the other side of it, right towards the actual mainland. Mm-hmm. I mean, with inflow from the main side on that.
They got mountain spring water.
And mountain spring water, which we all know is the most important water. But like, I mean, you got all these different sources, right? So the UK had like different chemical compositions for their water. So how did that affect what they produce as their typical styles?
Well, the thing is, you end up seeing styles that go all the way from the hoppiest, IPAs. The home of the IPA is on Burton-on-Trent. There's a specific location in England that had very, very good water for making hoppy beers. You got Ireland with Irish Reds. You got Scotland with wee heavies and Scottish exports that are big malty beers. And you have stouts and porters that came from all of those places.
Right.
So you do have a lot of variety in England. And then you have America, land of
light lagers.
Light lagers.
It's a triple L.
Land of light lagers.
Land of light lagers.
And that tells you that our water is good for making light beer. That's what we got. May as well work with it.
What's very interesting to me is the history of the water chemistry, or the lack thereof.
It is true. You almost never hear anyone talking about water chemistry. It's a footnote in most places. If you talk to homebrewers, they're like, how'd that work? was water chemistry. So it is an unknown science of a very important ingredient.
Right? And really this comes from in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when the big metric corporations were starting to consolidate what I would consider like the village level brewery or the local ale house kind of deal, right? So before that, it was pretty typical that a city might have or a town might have like the local brewer that would create the beer and sell the beer. And then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we started these big businesses being Coors and Bud, basically. And they started buying all these up, consolidating all of them into one piece. And in that, they understood their chemistry. They knew what they were doing. They knew their product that they were creating. So there was really no need to get into that science. And chemistry as a field was then focused really in the synthetics. And as we were into the industrial or the technological revolution, right? We started getting the internet, we started getting computers, we started getting, really just like pushing technology, right? We see that big boom in there. And so chemistry was focused in a different direction. And it wasn't until really the late 90s, 2000s, where we started seeing the big boom of the microbrews.
Microbrew.
Bell Brothers.
Good what?
And when you start to see these new microbrews pop back up, right, you saw the corporations like try to get back into it, right? The megaliths, the Bud, Coors, they started buying it back up again, right? Oh, we can't do that. But it started to grow. And it started to become big, it started to become homebrewy, right? And in that, we started to see a boom in the chemical or the chemistry and interest in the water chemistry of brewing.
And why do you think that was?
Well, I think the microbrewers really figured out that in order for them to make these different styles, like we saw from the world history, they needed to understand something different than just bringing in the ingredients from these different locations, right? And they have the natural, with that technological revolution, right? We have the travel bug, right? People are able to now get around the world in less than a day, 2 days capability. You can drive from city to city, town to town, state to state, all over the place. People move around. Military goes across overseas, right?
Yep. Well, you don't even have to go overseas. I can get a Belgian beer by going down to the store. I can get Japanese beer at the grocery store. You can get international beers anywhere.
Yeah, and so you started seeing this kind of international cultural revolution within the beer industry, and that drove the microbrewers, the homebrewers to be like, I want to do that here. You know, and I think they went, well, how do I do that? And they started brewing, and they realized very quickly that water chemistry was that solution.
Because it does not taste right. You cannot make a good German beer just using random water. It doesn't work. You got to balance it just right, or it doesn't taste right.
Well, I think that takes us into our next discussion, right? How do we get that baseline water chemistry, the foundation for our beer, before we start tweaking it either to a style or to a region?
Filtration. Like we said in the beginning, there are 3 types of filtration: carbon, distilled, and reverse osmosis.
Reverse osmosis, that's the best water. That's the cleanest water. You get pure H2O. All
right, water boy. No. Well, yes and no. Just like anything else, it's a tool, and its usefulness depends. It depends on energy.
But not like the depends I shit in, right?
No, not those kind of depends.
Oh, okay.
No, the kind of it depends because of the situation. So we prefer to use activated charcoal filters because they will filter out any chlorines, chloramines, any bugs, anything else. You have nice, clean water, but it doesn't remove any of your basic ions that are in your water. And that works fine. You can build off of the water that we have here. This is very specific to Colorado and any other place. You have to get your water report to know what's in your water. If you don't know, you can't fix it, you can't work with it, because you're just throwing stuff and seeing what sticks.
Right.
It's not a good way to brew.
Well, and that takes us somewhat into like the additive aspect, which we'll get into later. But really, you want to understand what chemical composition you have in your water before you start to add stuff to it, right? And so it's impossible for you to know whether or not you need to use reverse osmosis to get rid of everything because there's some contaminant that you need to get a hold of. Or is activated charcoal filter good? Or is neither one of those going to be decent and we need to go find or buy
distilled water?
Distilled water.
And so let's go into the situation where that does matter. So reverse osmosis, as he said, takes out everything. You have the purest water. The biggest issue with that is it's wasteful and it's expensive. To do reverse osmosis, you have to waste 2 to 1 in a lot of cases water. So you have 2 times as much wastewater as you get pure water that you're actually going to drink.
That would be a big problem as a microbrewer.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you're already doing what, 5 to 10 times as much water production
For cleaning?
for beer and cleaning, right? And then you're gonna double that again just to get reverse
clean
osmosis.
water to put in your beer.
Ooh-wee.
So it is an expensive way to go. And the equipment is expensive. So you got the upfront investment, and then you have the investment over time of water wasted to do this job. And yes, it gives you the purest water. However, the real case where that's important is if you have a very aggressive contaminant or you have very, very minerally water. If you have a lot of mineral hardness in your water to the point where you can't make a decent brew. If
There's like too much going on.
If you've got like 500, 600 parts per million of some of these things, you can't fix that with additives. It's going to be too minerally, it just won't taste right. You'll get mineral water beer.
Right.
It's not a thing you want to do. I've done it. I can tell you, don't want to do it.
Oh, Mom likes doing that, right? She takes her mineral seltzer water and mixes it with the beer.
Mom liking a thing is not proof that it's a good idea. If anything, it's proof that it's a bad idea.
All you need is the mineral water seltzer, right? Beer and coriander.
And coriander. Anyway, so it ends up being expensive. And even if you don't have the water issues, you then have to add back in all of that mineral water, or all those minerals and all of that ions to get brew water to work with. So then you have to spend more on more minerals to put back in. So you gotta take them all out, put them all back in again, and you gotta pay for the ones you put back in. So it's an expensive process. There are justifications for it, but most of the time, it's just not worth it. And then the other one is your distilled water, and that is, if you don't want to pay for a reverse osmosis system in the first place, because you're brewing at home and you only need 10 gallons, 20 gallons to do your brew that day,
Well, I guess
it's not so bad to go down to the store and buy it.
If it was just the brew water, not cleaning water, right? Like you can still use hose water for your cleaning water and then use the really special stuff for like brewing. Then at least you're not buying tons of it.
If you're just brewing for yourself, you're like, I brew once, twice a month,
Right.
maybe.
That wouldn't be too
then,
bad.
Yeah, you're talking, you go down to the store, you buy 10 gallons of water for, $20, and you move on. It's not so bad. But now that we've gone through all that, it's time to throw it back to Curtis to talk about additives.
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 So like I said in the intro, the additives really help in 3 different categories, right? And the yeast health and propagation, while a lot of that science is very interesting, I'm going to very briefly go over the 2 main ingredients for your yeast health and propagation. That's calcium and magnesium.
And if you want to know more about yeast health and propagation, once again, go watch the yeast video.
Exactly, right? We get into some really deep content in that. Excellent, worth the watch personally. But we're going to focus more on just water. So knowing that you need to add those in and pay attention to it is important, but really not mandatory for quote-unquote water chemistry. In that, what we're going to do is look at water chemistry as it imparts flavor in your beer. And that's a really interesting concept, personally, right? The first time I heard somebody say, well, yeah, water chemistry changes your flavor. I'm like, no. We have malts and hops to do that. Why am I doing that to change my flavors, right?
Yep. And if you really want to experience this, take a beer that's malty, add just a little bit of table salt to it. And you'll notice that it gets a lot sweeter. It has much more clean and interesting maltiness. A lot of old people have done this. You hear about a lot of people like, oh yeah, my uncle or my grandpa, he used to put salt in his Michelob. Just add a little bit of salt to your Michelob, your core, something like that. It'll really pump up the malty flavors. It's an interesting way to see this in real time for yourself.
Honestly, I have done it with our Dunkel, right?
Yeah.
When I was working through a couple of those. And it's really interesting to take some of those darker beers because it really kind of originated, I think, from a German style. I think a lot of our veterans have seen that because they were over in Germany and they got the sprinkled salt on there, or over in Europe, right? In any form, Europe does this, right? Because Europe's been doing it way longer than we've been around. You get that sprinkled salt on there. And yeah, the table salt, I mean, it's just amazing the complexities it brings out in the beer itself, and really kind of that malt character just jumps out. Table salt being
The greatest flavoring in the world, right?
not so much.
For the salt! All about salt.
Cody's got plenty of salt, even when he's playing games. He's salty as all get out. All you gotta do is kind of put a little bucket underneath, and you can collect all the salt you need out of it. He's so salty. No, the sodium chloride that you're putting in, the table salt, right, gives you that chloride, like I was just talking about. In bumping and changing your flavors one way or another in your brew, chloride is used for your malting or your malt flavors and your sweetness. Now, if you didn't want to do a multi-focused or malt-centric beer, you could also push it in the other direction.
You just throw a whole lot of hops in it, right?
Tons of hops. Just tons of hops, right? Like really, you could have a malty beer and you just hop the crap out of it.
It makes a really good beer, right?
Really good beer. No. Instead, what you need to do is use sulfates. So sulfates are able to then enhance your bitterness and your hop flavors. And that kind of pumps the whole beer in the opposite direction.
So I just add as much sulfate as I want, right? Just keep pouring more sulfate in there. You know, grab my bag of Epsom salts and just put a whole pound in there. And I'll have the hoppiest beer ever made.
That's a good point, actually. So one thing to point out there is he said Epsom salts, right? So we're talking about table salt. I said calcium and chloride, right? Which actually comes in calcium chloride. And Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate. So really, those are your big three salts that you need to add to your water in one form or another to really enhance your flavors. And you can get a feel for kind of where you want to play with that at that point in time.
The only other one you really come into is gypsum, and you need that if you're trying to make a really hoppy beer, and it's a weird balancing one. Yeah. We almost never end up using it. You can do almost everything just using a bunch of Epsom salt.
Yeah, you just need a little bit of it sometimes to kind of tweak a character one way or another. Gypsum's important, but it's not as important as those big three, I think.
Yep.
Now, in that, you do reach a point of diminishing returns when you start pushing your chemicals beyond realism, right? And you're not putting in like a cup of salt, right? Like that's not how that flies. Really, we're talking like
several grams.
Yeah, like a couple of grams. Really, I'm talking a couple of grams of either one of these, right? 2, 3. If you watch our brew videos, the B3 brews, you notice that like one of them, like maybe 3 grams might get up there, right? Like that's it. Like there's not a lot in there. It's a sprinkle at the very bottom. But what you're looking at really is maximum a 2-to-1 ratio, right? You want either two. So say we're going to do a hoppy one. You want to do 2 times the sulfate that you would normally get for chloride, right? So 1 chloride to 2 parts sulfate. And that's going to give you a hoppier, more bitter one. Although you also get, if you start going much beyond that, or you just add tons and tons, like in your sense of like when you're talking about the RO water, right? Where you've got something with 500 or 600 parts per million. Yeah, you could technically kind of balance it out with the other, but it's not.
It gets weird and minerally. It tastes like mineral water.
Yeah, exactly. So at a certain point, you get mineral water again, and you defeat the whole purpose of the filtration and all that. It's
Nobody buys mineral water to make beer.
No, exactly. Really, so that's what you're looking for is do that piece of it. Now, the final piece, the third aspect of water additives is pH balance. What is pH balance, Cody? What am I doing there?
So you go, and then you balance. That's it, right?
Is the pH fat?
Like the pH fat balance. No.
Really, and in our case, we use lactic acid. Honestly, you could use just about any acid, but there's an interesting piece of history that kind of comes.
Any food-safe acid. Okay. I don't think anybody wants me putting fluoride, hydrofluoric acid in the beer. I won't have a pot after I put hydrofluoric acid in it, but still, I could technically
yes.
pH with hydrofluoric.
All right. Yes, you can play around with your pH by throwing weird acids in there, but no, we're talking about food-grade usable acids, and in that we use lactic acid. And what you're looking to do is bring the acidity of your water into a realm between 5 and 5.5 so that the mashing is the most efficient. And what is that affecting inside my mash?
That's affecting your enzymatic activity. So enzymes like to work at certain pH balances. The enzymes in your stomach like to work in very acidic environments. Surprise, surprise, they're in your stomach where there's a lot of acid. The enzymes in beer like to work at between 5.5 and 5. And they're at their most efficient. And efficiency is good because that means you get more sugar for less malt, which is costly.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could reduce your efficiency, right? You buy like 20, 30 pounds worth of grains and you'd get like a 5.5%, 5-gallon beer, ABV, and it'd be like, wow, that was really expensive for not a whole lot of alcohol. Plus the flavors on that has got to be horrendous.
Yeah. Well, so I've heard there's some interesting history between malt and pH balance in your water. You want to tell me about that?
Yeah, so as you're adding this pH, the whole reason why you start doing that is kind of in that same realm of the regional development. The different waters around the world have different acidities in them. And why you end up seeing dark or light malt being used in each one of these different regions. So these dark malts create a lower pH, which is why we don't actually have to add as much of the lactic acid in when we're doing a darker beer. So when you're doing your stouts, your porters, your dunkels, right, that kind of stuff, you're going to see a lot less or zero, of your lactic acid needed to be in there to balance out the pH and make your enzymes happy. On the flip side, your water for your light beers, or your lighter beers anyways, right, need more acid in order to bring it down into that level, and so you end up adding more lactic acid. Now again, we're talking about realms of tens of grams. Now really 5 single grams, right? 2, 3, 4, 5 grams of lactic acid. Minimal amounts on that aspect. With the United States being like the land of the light lager, Cody, what kind of water do we have?
We probably have a fairly acidic type of water in a lot of these places where they're producing light lagers. Because you don't need to add a lot of dark malt to get your acidity to the right levels. So I would make a guess, fairly acidic water. I mean, here in our brew, we don't end up using much acid. We talk about 5 to 7 grams, and I think our water is fairly acidic. I haven't checked it in a while, but it's not too, well, not acidic. It has not got a lot of alkalinity that we then have to work against to get our pH balance to where we want for our mash.
Right, exactly. So ultimately, I think this boils down to, we'll call it the Bell Brothers equation for water chemistry. And that is, water is equal to purity
Plus additives.
Fantastic. Now eventually we'll build up this big equation that is beer. Beer.
And I think the next one we were going to go into is probably malt, because I think that's a good segue. You know, we've been talking a lot about how malt affects water, and
Right.
water affects malt, so now we can move into the malt.
So look for either next month or the month after, we're going to be doing another science video on malts. Thanks again for visiting us here at Bell Brothers Brewing. As always, make sure you hit that like and subscribe. It means a lot to us. Head on over to the YouTube channel, or if you're at the YouTube channel, thanks for coming over. Check out our other videos. Some of our older stuff, kind of funny.
Yep. Or just bad. Or so bad it's funny. It's part of being a YouTuber is you get better over time. You watch your old stuff, you cringe at it, you laugh at it. But tell your friends. We need more people.
We do need some more subscribers over here, right? Your like, your subscribe, your viewership is what enables us to continue to make this content, to continue to push forward and produce.
And it just makes us feel good.
Yes, it does. It is rewarding in its own way.
Warm and fuzzy in the tummy.
So while we've been struggling for 3 years to try to open a brewery, this has been really our way to interact with the community.
So thank you for being here. It's been Engineers Talking About Beers.
Cheers.
Hello, welcome to Bell Brothers Brewing.
Engineers talking about beers.
Today we're talking about
Nope.
Supposed to do
Brew water.
water.
What is it good for?
Absolutely everything. Not nothing, everything. Beer is mostly water. You can't just ignore the water
Why are we talking about water?
because it is really important to the flavors. Hold on, do the why are we talking about? There's too long of a gap there.
Yeah. Okay. You want to tell me about purity?
Yeah.
How? Okay.
Go. Mold capsule, mold
Spores.
spores.
So additives really enhance 3 different characteristics. So head on over to our yeast video.
So now we're going to take a step back here because one of the most interesting parts of brewing water is the history. And I think one of the more interesting parts of that history is the world history and how it's affected world styles across the world. I'm going to say world a lot.
Yeah, you want to redo
that? World. Right. All right. 3 types of filtration. Carbon,
Table salt, right? Being calcium, no, sodium
chloride.
there we go.
Oh.
Is because dark malt, or those dark roasted malts, create a lower pH, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You got it right.
There we go. Yeah.
Good outro? I think that was good.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hot. I mean, I can cut pieces of that, but in general, it feels solid. Is there anything you want to go back and revisit, re-hit?
I think we nailed it.
I think it went across. Yeah, I don't think we missed anything.
All right. Pack up, finish the last of the stuff, and then get out of here.
And it's less than a half an hour worth of video.
Yeah, should be.